Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the CES Day at the Cryosphere Pavilion of COP28. And I would like to thank ICCI for hosting us. And my name is Letizia Tedesco. I'm a senior research scientist at the Finnish Environment Institute. And together with my speaker today, we will walk you through the role of CI's biogeochemistry and ecosystem in the Earth system. So this session is organized by BEPSII. BEPSII stands for Biogeochemical Exchange Processes at CI's interfaces. We are an open international network of polar scientists, and we are dedicated to study, to investigate, to review the biogeochemical and the ecological processes in the CI zones. I'm chairing this group together with Jacqueline Stafford. She is based at University of Groningen, and the other 11 members of the steering committee. They are all from around the world, and they also include two early career scientists. So BEPSII was born in 2012 as a SCAR working group, and after that, we have continued to receive funding from SOLAS, from CLIC, from IASC, and from SCAR. And thanks to them, we also have been growing. I believe that at the moment we are about 200 in our mailing list. So what we do for the science community, we publish different kind of papers, review paper, position analysis, commentaries. We have also coordinated special issues. Our last special issues on Elementa. We have an online presence on a variety of media channels. And we are also very much committed to educate a new generation of polar scientists. We have organized our first field school last year in May in Cambridge Bay in Nunavut, and we are already planning our next field school, which will happen in 2026 in Sanomako Lagoon in Japan. For policymakers, we already have made one policy brief focusing on the Arctic, and we are already organizing and preparing our next one on Antarctic sea ice. And finally, we also want to make our science available to the younger generations, and our early career scientists in the steering committee, Pat Wong Pan from University of Tasmania, has been coordinated this special collection in Frontiers for Young Minds, where we focus on the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. So next, I would like to briefly set the stage for this session. So if you are not familiar with sea ice, this might come as a surprise, but sea ice is very dynamic. Chemically and biologically, it's a very dynamic and active habitat. There are a lot of processes that happen within sea ice at the interface with the ocean, at the interface with the atmosphere, and also in the atmosphere and in the ocean, which are mediated by sea ice. This schematic just show you, the variety and the complexity of the system, and we will actually go through some of these processes. Our speakers will go through some of this process next in the session. Sea ice is not only very dynamic, but it's also a very diverse system. So within sea ice itself, there is such an abundance of life. A variety of organisms, from bacteria, viruses, and algae to fungi to small fauna, they all live within sea ice. And even within sea ice, there's diversity, and you can find different species at the top of sea ice, in the middle of the sea ice, and at the bottom of sea ice. And on top of that, a variety of organisms, they do rely on sea ice for their existence. And at least for some part of their life cycle, for example, for breeding, for mating, or for feeding. And I'm not only talking about, the polar bear in the Arctic Ocean or the emperor penguin in the Southern Ocean, but I'm talking about all of those organisms that, are part of both polar ocean food web. And in particular, I would like to mention the Arctic cod, the polar cod, in the Arctic Ocean, and the Antarctic krill in the Southern Ocean. Those are keystone species which are vitally important for the transfer of energy from the lower trophic level up to the trophic level until, top predators and has as a human. And sea ice is also a very rich ecosystem. So if you have been lucky, some of you have been lucky enough to be there and see it. So the sea ice system itself is very, very productive. So what you can see in this photo is how much productive it can be. So you see discoloration, mostly due to pigmentation. And it's worth to mention that the highest chlorophyll concentration of any aquatic environment has been found on sea ice. However, sea ice is also changing, and is changing very fast and very rapidly, both in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And I mean, if you can run the first video, the one on the left. So what I'm showing you here is the changes in sea ice stand from 1981. From 2002 to recent days in comparison, so that the thin blue line represent the mean sea ice extent between 1981 to 2020. So you can appreciate the change. And this is for the sea ice minimum, and as in the Arctic on the left and in the Southern Ocean on the right. If you can play the other one, Hamid, thank you. So what are the implications of these changes for sea ice biogeochemistry, for sea ice ecosystem? What do we know? What we still don't know? What are the uncertainties? And how good we are to communicate these, in places like this at COP. So these are some of the questions that our speaker today will answer to. And with that said, I would like to introduce them. So our first speaker today is Delphine Lanuzel. She is based at the University of Tasmania. Delphine is one of the members of the steering committee, and she will present today one of the BEPSII paper which focus on near future changes in Arctic sea ice biogeochemistry and ecosystems. Our second speaker today is Sian Halley. Sian is from the University of Edinburgh. She has been involved with BEPSII for quite a time, also leading some of our papers. And today, Sian will talk about Antarctic sea ice as a living and life-sustaining system. Our third speaker is Nadia Steiner. Nadia, she's from Fisheries and Ocean Canada, and she's former BEPSII chair. And she also will talk about one of the BEPSII paper that she has been led, which focuses on sea ice ecosystem services. Our fourth speaker today is Lisa Miller, also based at Fisheries and Ocean Canada, also member of the steering committee. And Lisa, today she will talk about a very sensitive topic, which is the biogeochemical implication of geoengineering sea ice, also one of our BEPSII papers that she has been leading. And finally, our last speaker today is Cassandra Brooks. Cassandra is based at the University of Colorado Boulder in the US. She is new to BEPSII. We hope to get her more and more involved with us. She has done an amazing job protecting Antarctica, and she will talk today about building resilience and safeguarding global values. And with said that, and without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Delphine. Please share your screen, and the floor is yours.
All right, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm having some technical difficulties, so let's see how we go. I'll just share my screen. The work I'm presenting today involves over 30 sea ice experts in chemistry and biology, therefore truly representing understanding and view of the Arctic sea ice system, as well as now and in the future. So the motivation of the work, as Laetitia just presented, comes from looking at the drastic and dramatic changes that we've seen in Arctic sea ice over the last 40 or so years, with a loss of 3.5 million square kilometers, which is about twice the size as Alaska. Those changes, if you look and plot them against CO2 emissions, you can see a linear fit, and that's work from Knotts and Strova in 2016. They've since updated this with more data. But it shows you that for about every ton of CO2 that is emitted in the atmosphere, which is around about how much a UK citizen would emit every 7 weeks, we lose about 3 square meters of sea ice, which is about the size of a pool table. Those changes are happening across all seasons and are even more prominent in summer. And so models suggest that we will have ice-free summers in the Arctic by 2050. The sea ice is forming later and melting earlier than it used to, and it's also changing in its nature. It's becoming thinner and younger because we're losing a lot of multi-year sea ice. which is replaced by first-year sea ice, which is forming and melting completely every year. The sea ice is also warmer than ever before. So we wanted to look at how these changes in the type and seasons in sea ice were going to affect a suite of chemical and biological parameters in the Arctic. So as Letty just presented quickly, sea ice is often considered as being inert in Earth system models, but it's actually fairly active. We have a lot of biology and chemistry. You have exchanges of gases, solutes and nutrients through the sea ice. And as you can see in this complex picture, it's fairly interconnected. One thing that we look at quite a lot is the growth of ice algae and phytoplankton. So you have here at the interface between the ice and the ocean some of the densest ever recorded biomass in aquatic environments, and that happens if you have enough light and nutrients for that to happen, because we rely on photosynthesis here. You also have under ice phytoplankton bloom, as well as open ocean phytoplankton bloom. And all these together form the base of the food web in the Arctic, as well as in Antarctic. Actually, Sean will talk about that in a second. And you have a whole ecosystem that is really reliant on that formation and melt cycle every year. Phytoplankton and ice algae also produce a whole suite of ecosystem services, because you can, through that photosynthesis and fixation of carbon dioxide, the carbon can then, through the formation of dense aggregates, be exported to the seafloor. So we call that the biological pump of carbon, which is fairly efficient in the Arctic because of the large aggregates that we have from sea ice. Sea ice also allows the exchange of climate active gases like CO2 that I just talked about, as well as methane, which is also a greenhouse gas. And we also have here it's written DMS, it's dimethyl sulfide, and it's a gas that is produced by phytoplankton and ice algae, and it's then emitted into the atmosphere, forms cloud condensation nuclei, and eventually clouds. And these have a cooling effect. So you can see the balance between some of the greenhouse gas that are warming a planet versus some that may help into the cooling. So looking into the future and how changes in sea ice will affect some of those variables, I'm just showing you a few of them, not all of them. You can look at our paper in more detail if you're interested. Looking at biota and starting from the very, very small, so starting from ice algae and phytoplankton, the primary producers, we expect that because we'll continue to have less sea ice in the future, and the sea ice is also thinner, that we'll have more transfer of light, therefore potentially boosting prime productivity in the Arctic Ocean. That comes to a limit depending on how much nutrients we actually have available in the sea ice and the ocean. What we will see is an overall shift towards phytoplankton species because their domain is becoming bigger as sea ice is shrinking. And that leads us to consumers which are feeding on phytoplankton and ice algae will have, especially in the case of ice-dependent consumers, their life cycles will be disrupted because of warmer and shorter ice seasons, and we may see a replacement of polar communities by subpolar species. And an example of that is that you may see some of the zooplankton that is currently fairly large and nutritious being replaced by maybe more numerous but smaller and less nutritious types of zooplankton. That then has an effect on the next level up in the food chain, for example, polar cod and other cold adapted fish, which will see a decline in the future because of the changes in the availability of food. We also obviously talk a lot about the iconic fauna in the Arctic, like the beluga whales and ring seals and polar bears, which are relying on sea ice to function. They will face the risk of local to regional extinction in some areas, and that can be to the benefit of some more generalist species like orcas, and some species of birds as well will be more adapted to less sea ice conditions. I talked about the biological pump of carbon a little bit at the start, and we expect that because we'll have a change in the type of phytoplankton and ice algae that we'll have in the Arctic, we expect that the export of carbon to the seafloor might be less efficient than it is right now. So we'll have more recycling and retention of carbon in the pelagic realm. Moving on to gases, CO2, the jury is out. Because at the moment the Arctic Ocean is a CO2 sink, and we expect that potentially if you have more productivity we should have more CO2 sequestration, but that might be offset by changes into the hydrography in the Arctic. So we may see more stratification, which may cap how much CO2 is being taken up in the surface ocean. And you can also have some outgassing of CO2 in some regions. So it's quite it's something that we don't really have a good prediction on at the moment on CO2. Methane, which is another climate greenhouse gas, is currently the largest reservoirs of methanes are in the permafrost as well as in the sediments, and their efflux or transfer into the atmosphere is at the moment in some places limited by sea ice. So if you think that you're removing the sea ice, then you can end up having more methane being released into the atmosphere. Some of that warming could potentially be counterbalanced by DMS. We expect that because dimethyl sulfide is produced through primary productivity, and we'll see an increase into prime productivity potentially, as well as having a more expensive marginal ice zone where you usually see a fair amount of DMS production, that we will see a result in increased productivity in DMS potentially in the future. So you can see that the picture of those different variables are presented are quite complex, and there are some winners and some losers. And we produced that map that is showing you what the sign of the change might be depending on the regions around the Arctic that you are in. Some will see an increase, others will see a decrease, and some others, like for example nutrients, we don't really know which way the balance is going to tip. What is clear is that the Arctic Ocean will see an increase in prime productivity, but we'll see a loss in biodiversity, especially the species that are currently ice dependent. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delphine. We will have questions at the end of the session. So I would like to move forward, and I would like to invite Sean on the stage.
Thank you to Laetitia, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak within this session. So I am, just whilst the amazing tech team here is putting up the display, I am just going to introduce my talk. So mine is really the southern hemisphere counterpart to what Delphine just talked about in the Arctic. So we're now coming down to the Antarctic at the very south of the planet, and talking about the ecosystems that live within and around the sea ice that forms on a seasonal basis. So I've got some images on the screen here. The one on the left is what it looks like when we've got full sea ice cover. So a really or fairly smooth cover of ice, which can attach to the land. See the land here. Just to show off a little bit, I was in that aeroplane, so that was a fantastic experience in that flight. And then on the far right hand side now, this is what it looks like when the complete sea ice cover starts to break up like it does in springtime. And when it does that, it kickstarts lots of biological processes in the upper ocean. And then the middle image there is the bottom of an ice core, so a tube of ice that's been drilled out from the ice cover. And what you can see is the ice algae that Delphine was talking about is like this kind of mat on the bottom of the ice, almost like hair or some kind of fibrous substance. But this is actually a whole world of life, and it underpins the whole functioning of the ecosystem because it provides the food source for everything else that relies on this sea ice. So there are two main reasons that Antarctic sea ice is important for ecosystems, both within the Southern Ocean and elsewhere throughout the global ocean system. So the first one is that organisms, this is anything from the tiniest microscopic plants up to blue whales, these organisms rely on Antarctic sea ice for their habitat, something about what they need and where they live, and their nutrition, so what they need to eat in order to sustain them and let them complete their life cycles. So this image here comes from a summary for policymakers from a big assessment that we did on the Southern Ocean over the last few years, called the Marine Ecosystem Assessment for the Southern Ocean, or MESO for short. So what this image is showing is the things in the Earth system that are causing change in the sea ice. So that's its extent, its duration, how long it lasts, and its thickness. And then the image also aims to look at the impacts of these sea ice changes on the organisms that live here and the ecosystems that they're part of. So we'll go straight on to who lives in and around Antarctic sea ice and why it's important. So the first group is the phytoplankton. Now, these are the microscopic plants that live in the surface ocean. The sea ice is important for them because the sea ice stabilizes the surface ocean and provides a source of iron, just like Delphine was talking about. So we get these large phytoplankton blooms, which provide the bottom of the food web, or the base of the food web, that everything else relies on. And similarly, we have the algae within the ice itself, that hair-like mucky stuff on the bottom of the ice. And this is a very important food source for small organisms that graze on this ice algae and in turn feed the larger organisms in the system. And that's depicted by the image at number 2 here. So we've got these two groups of what we call primary producers. They are doing the photosynthesis. They're taking up carbon and producing oxygen. So they're very important for the health of the ocean system as a whole. And these are consumed by some very important organisms, including Antarctic krill. Now, Antarctic krill are so important because they provide the key link between the tiny plants and algae at the base of the food web and the larger animals that we recognize as Southern Ocean animals, like the penguins, the whales, and the seals. So if we have a disruption to the amount of Antarctic krill, the whole ecosystem is in trouble. And the Antarctic krill relies on this sea ice for its habitat over the winter and as a food source, particularly for young krill. So it's important for krill completing their reproductive cycles and therefore the population sustaining itself. And then sea ice is also an important home for the rock cod, hiding on the far left of the figure, and the Antarctic silverfish at number 3. And this system and the organisms that live within it are being impacted by lots of things associated with climate change. So winds are becoming more intense, precipitation, so rain and snow, is changing, and the waves are also changing in their nature. And this is having a strong impact on the sea ice system and its ability to support life. Sea ice is also a real hotbed of processing of different chemical elements because of these microscopic organisms that live within it. So we've got ice algae taking up carbon and nutrients from the surrounding environment, as shown on the bottom of these sea ice chunks here by the red arrows. And these communities of microbes also cycle nutrients, so are very involved in recycling and supporting the health of the whole ecosystem. We also see exchanges of nutrients and lots of other dissolved things between the ice and the water column underneath. And this is important because one of those things that is exchanged is the carbon dioxide, as Delphine talked about in the Arctic, as well as dimethyl sulfide. And both of these compounds are important in regulating the climate on a small local scale and at a much larger regional up to global scale. And because the Southern Ocean acts as the center of the global ocean circulation system, the changes that sea ice is driving in the surface Southern Ocean have consequences throughout the global ocean system. So this is not just important for the area around Antarctica, it's important at a much larger scale than that. Now, I've talked about emissions of organic sulfur compounds. The best known example is dimethyl sulfide. So this is what sea ice does, its role in the ecosystem. There are two reasons it's important, but this is changing. In recent years, we've seen striking losses of Antarctic sea ice, particularly in the most recent 2 years. But we can see from these plots of the sea ice extent over time in the southern summer at the top and southern winter, sorry, at the top and southern summer at the bottom, we can see that there was a threshold around 2015 where the sea ice went from relatively stable or possibly increasing a little bit to these rapid declines through to 2023. And sea ice declined in particular. Lots of records were broken in the summer of 2022, over winter of 2023, and it looks like those records will be broken again in the summer that we are currently going into. So this plot here shows the extent of ice in the white that was measured in February 2023, and the purple line is the long-term average of where sea ice should be in February. And you can see that in the most recent year, the sea ice extent was much smaller than it normally is. And this means that the role of sea ice in the wider system is becoming less important and is potentially influencing the way that the whole system functions. So if we think about what might happen going forward to Antarctic sea ice as a living and life-sustaining system, I've put up here the different warming scenarios under the latest IPCC report, with the dark red being the business as usual scenario and the light blue being the best case scenario. The two blue ones are consistent with the Paris Agreement of keeping warming to within 1.5 degrees of the pre-industrial level by the year 2100. And what we don't yet have a compelling image of from the scientific community is these very well constrained lines for Antarctic sea ice, because there's different models which show different trends. So we don't yet have a firm idea of how sea ice will change under the different warming scenarios. But what we do know from the modelling that has taken place is that sea ice loss accelerates significantly as warming exceeds that 1.5 degree threshold, according to the Paris Agreement. And the low sea ice years, like the most recent one, the most recent summer, and the summer that we appear to be going into, these will become more common. And when these years are more common, this will have impacts throughout the system because of the important role that sea ice plays. So we'll be looking at a situation where we go from this being the norm in early summer and then retreating from there to a situation where the ice might be intermediate. There might be years where there's a lot of sea ice, there might be years where there's less sea ice, and then as warming proceeds, we're likely to see more conditions where there is very low sea ice or perhaps none in certain areas. So we're talking about these low sea ice conditions becoming a more regular feature of the Antarctic seasonal cycle. And because of the important role that sea ice plays, this is likely to mean that habitat for a wide range of organisms is lost, and they also have either a loss or a reduction in their food source. And this could change the functioning of the whole ecosystem and could potentially lead to an entire rearrangement of these ecosystems or restructuring, which means that they function in a completely different way, and everything that relies on them therefore has to deal with that shifting baseline and the services that Antarctic sea ice provides. The processes that I talked about that are important in sea ice will also be changed as sea ice coverage changes, and this will have much broader implications for the way the Southern Ocean functions because of the important role that sea ice plays. So above 1.5 degrees, if we exceed that threshold, which hopefully we won't, at least not on a sustained basis, will cause large-scale disruption to the way Antarctic sea ice operates and have implications for everything in the system that relies on the Antarctic sea ice. Whereas below 1.5 degrees C of warming above the pre-industrial, the declines in sea ice are slowed dramatically, and these low sea ice years are much less common than they are if warming exceeds that threshold. And that means that the impacts of those reductions will be much less, and organisms stand a much better chance of coping with them and adapting over a period of time that they can manage, rather than the change being too fast for them to be able to cope with. So this is my final slide and my closing statement, which is that if we stick to the 1.5 degrees C threshold, Antarctic sea ice will be in much better shape. So from the point of view of Antarctic sea ice and many other physical realities in the Earth system, we must stick to within 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial. And not only do we need to do this, but the sooner we do it, the better. And therefore, we really urge the Antarctic sea ice, really urges the negotiators and the decision makers at this COP to make the decisions that will keep us within that warming upper limit of 1.5 degrees C in agreement with the Paris Agreement. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. So our next speaker is Nadia Steiner. Nadia, when you are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Just kind of moving here. So I would like to talk today about sea ice ecosystems and ecosystem services. My name is Nadia Steiner. I'm a Fisheries and Oceans Canada research scientist. And I would like to showcase that sea ice ecosystems are ecologically and biologically significant areas, and that they support key ecosystem services. That global emissions driving climate change are directly linked to the demise of sea ice ecosystems and its ecosystem services, as we already heard before. And that includes the Inuit provisioning and cultural services. I would also like to show that marine conservation can reduce stress on sea ice ecosystems, but that the key mitigation measure is a reduction in carbon emissions. So, what are sea ice ecosystem services? The term ecosystem refers to the combination of living things in an area, their interaction with each other and their environment. And the ecosystems benefit the well-being of human beings in many ways. And we refer to these services or these benefits as ecosystem services. Ecosystem services can be provisioning, regulating, supporting, or cultural, and I will show a few details with respect to sea ice on that. Understanding these ecosystem services can help guide decisions regarding the environment. This includes like fishing measures or restrictions, ship traffic conservation, as well as emission reductions. So sea ice ecosystem services, sea ice ecosystems provide regulating services. That is, for example, with respect to the control of planetary radiative balances. This includes the production of biogenic aerosols, atmospheric cleansing, the release and uptake of climate-relevant gases such as carbon dioxide and dimethyl sulfide. With a changing climate, we see reductions and changes of the sea ice surface that impacts these processes and the amount of flux that is happening. It changes the sea ice primary production, both in terms of timing and location, and it changes the emissions, uptake, or interactions with climate-relevant gases. The sea ice also provides supporting services, mostly through energy transfers via key forage species, as an example. And one of those, or like some of those species have been mentioned before already. Key species are Arctic cod in the Arctic and Antarctic krill in the Antarctic. Those species are key forage species that support the higher trophic levels, and their life cycle maintenance is strongly linked to sea ice. But sea ice also provides feeding grounds and nursery for species from small little microbes all the way to meiofauna, fish, birds, and mammals. With climate change, we see a significant habitat loss for those species. We see changes in seasonal growth processes, predator-prey mismatches, as well as the spreading of viruses. The third ecosystem service is provisioning services. This refers to things like fishing, subsistence harvesting, for example. And this is in the Arctic, particular harvesting of country foods, but also commercial fisheries. This is more so in the Southern Ocean, but also can include the supply of medicinal and genetic resources. With the climate change, we are seeing changes in species distribution, both timing and location, and that severely impacts harvesting practices. We see changes in productivity and biomass, which has mixed impacts. We see a loss of nursery grounds for many species, and we see a spread in infectious diseases. The last ecosystem service is cultural service. This includes the Inuit way of life, but also exploration and tourism. For the Inuit, the sea ice really is a base for indigenous and local knowledge systems, as well as for cultural identity and spirituality. It's an inspiration and attraction for cultural activities, as well as tourism and research. With climate change, we are seeing changes that are faster than ever experienced. They are not traditional anymore, so they're limiting what can be understood from traditional knowledge. They provide a feeling of loss. They have negative impacts on iconic species such as penguins, elephant seals, polar bears, and which leads to tourist access closures, which we've already seen in the Antarctic. If you want to understand the climate change impacts on Inuit communities, this requires to include traditional knowledge and share that and co-develop methods or tools that help us understand how climate change impacts the Inuit subsistence fisheries. This is an example of a co-production for an Inuit calendar. And this calendar indicates seasonal changes in environmental conditions and associated harvesting activities. It has been co-produced with a community of Olokhaktok in the Northwest Territories in Canada. And the left side shows like the current situation where, like, depending on sea ice, like species appear, harvesting activities happen over the year. And with climate change, we moving more to the right side, like where we have much longer open water season, where species appear at different times, where wave action becomes much more active and distressing, and makes hunting or harvesting more difficult. The Inuit see themselves as a part of the ecosystem, not as the ecosystem as a service to them, but they are actually part of the system. So their seasonal cycle of harvesting and subsistence is intricately linked with the sea ice. And if the sea ice changes, it changes themselves in addition to with the ecosystem. So marine conservation or marine protected areas are key management tools to maintain biodiversity, ecosystem function, and to secure the delivery of marine ecosystem services. In the Antarctic, many proposals exist but lack international agreement, and we will hear more from Cassandra on this later on. There is a few existing MPAs which are marked in green on the left side. In the Arctic, there are a lot of areas of heightened ecological and cultural significant or identified as ecological and biological significant areas, but those far exceed the actual designated marine protected areas. But conservation experts include protected areas that have specifically designed for their sea ice ecosystems and which have key Inuit involvement and leadership. There is a few MPAs as well as national marine conservation areas and newer indigenous protected and conserved areas. In the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the request has been made to protect at least 30% of the world's land, water, coastal, and marine areas, but we are still quite a ways away from that. In terms of marine conservation, identifying ecologically or biologically significant areas is a key component in the development of marine protected areas. And we have evaluated the sea ice for these components: uniqueness, special importance, importance to threatened and endangered species, vulnerability, productivity, biodiversity. And the sea ice ecosystem scores high in almost all of them, which really highlights the relevance of sea ice ecosystems in conservation efforts. So in summary, the sea ice ecosystem meet the criteria for these BEPSIIs. They support all 4 ecosystem service categories and deserve specific attention in the evaluation of marine protected area planning. Global emissions driving climate change are directly linked to the demise of sea ice ecosystems and its ecosystem services, which has responses of sea ice associated primary production, biogeochemical processes, and effects on ice-associated mammals and birds are predominantly negative, impacting human harvesting and cultural services. Inuit subsistence practices and timings are severely impacted by the loss of sea ice and its impact on marine ecosystems. Marine conservation can reduce stress on sea ice ecosystems. However, the key mitigation measure that can slow down the transition to a strictly sea seasonal ice cover, reduce the loss of sea ice habitats, and preserve the unique sea ice ecosystem services to humans is a reduction in carbon emission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And our next speaker will be Lisa Miller. Lisa, when you are ready, the floor is yours.
There we go. There we go. Okay, my apologies. So you can hear me okay? You can see my slides. So thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity to speak to you today. And particularly, thank you to ICCI for hosting us. This is really, really a marvelous opportunity you've allowed for us. I am speaking to you today from a foggy, dark morning in the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanich nations in what is now called British Columbia, Canada. And I've been asked to talk to you about Arctic sea ice restoration as a climate intervention strategy. That is geoengineering sea ice to mitigate climate change. Now, this may sound like a pretty far out idea, but it is a crazy idea, but it's not so far out. In the absence of sufficient cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, there are groups out there conducting tests and requesting permits for larger and larger field tests. Now, the idea behind this is that of enhancing planetary albedo, or reflectivity. The open water absorbs the vast majority of sunlight absorbs the vast majority of the incoming sunlight and warms, whereas ice reflects most of the incoming sunlight and doesn't warm as much. This results in a feedback loop with climate warming, whereby as temperatures increase, snow and ice melts, darker surfaces are revealed, reducing the albedo or the reflectivity, increasing the absorption of heat, and further increasing the temperature. So the idea is that if we could somehow halt or slow the melting of the sea ice, we could break this feedback loop. Okay, now the ideas that there are two ideas that are for artificially restoring sea ice that are being seriously considered. One is to deploy windmills on the ice that during the winter will pump seawater up onto the top of the ice where it will freeze quickly, thickening the ice and therefore making it more likely to survive the whole summer melt season so that when fall comes around again, there's still some ice left. The other proposal is to spread glass microspheres that are highly reflective on top of the ice, increasing its reflectivity even more so that in the summer it doesn't absorb as much heat and doesn't warm as much and melt as quickly. Again, the idea is to help the ice survive the whole summer. Now, there are a lot of questions about whether or not either of these ideas would actually work to increase planetary albedos and reduce global temperatures. And there's a significant amount of research being done into that. But there are also a lot of questions about potential side effects, which is what I mainly want to talk about today. As we've already heard from the previous speakers, the sea ice is intimately connected to both the polar atmosphere and the ocean, impacting how the whole system operates. And the important thing to realize is that artificially restoring the sea ice would not restore the Arctic to its natural state. We would have a different new Arctic. This diagram here tries to represent that. This middle panel represents natural sea ice. The left, how things would operate if the surface of the ice were flooded and frozen from the top. And the right, what the system would look like with the glass microbeads spread upon it. And the point is that, and I think something that hopefully you've gotten from the other speakers, is that the processes by which sea ice forms and melts impact the whole system, and changing the processes by which sea ice freezes and melts would have cascading impacts throughout the Earth system. The first example I want to talk about is how flooding the ice and freezing in the winter would impact atmospheric chemistry. When seawater freezes, it releases gases, salts, and organic matter. Normally, in the wintertime, sea ice freezes primarily from the bottom, so that all that material goes into the water. If you were to freeze sea ice from the top during the winter, all of that material would go into the atmosphere. Now, the impact of aerosols in the atmosphere really depends on whether or not the sun is out. During the day or during the polar summer, aerosols absorb and scatter the incoming solar radiation, acting to effectively cool the atmosphere. However, at night and during the polar winter, those same aerosols will absorb and scatter the outgoing heat being emitted from the planet out into space, trapping that heat and warming the atmosphere. Okay, so releasing aerosols in the winter would actually warm the Arctic and undermine efforts to cool it during the summer. The other example I want to talk about is the potential for the glass microbeads, which are made of silica, to fertilize the ocean. Now, tests have been done with these microbeads on big animals, and apparently, if ducks or seals eat them, they don't seem to be harmed. However, silicate is an essential nutrient for many marine single-celled plants, the phytoplankton that the others have been talking about, and which are the basis of ocean ecosystems. To put this potential impact into perspective, this is a satellite photo from the North Atlantic from last spring. And this is the area that's been proposed as a likely most effective area to deploy these sea ice geoengineering techniques. It's the area where sea ice and water is flowing out of the Arctic into the North Atlantic. Down here, hopefully you can see it in the resolution, you can see evidence of a phytoplankton bloom, and that cloudy color indicates that these microalgae have shells primarily of calcium carbonate, not silicate. So dumping a lot of silicon into this outflow from the Arctic could change the ecosystem structure far downstream. Now, whenever you change an ecosystem structure, there are always winners and losers, but the outcome is really difficult to predict. It's really hard to say what this would do to the fisheries of the North Atlantic or even, say, off Mauritania. Now, I've just given you 2 examples, but there are many more possible side effects and unintended consequences that have to be considered and studied before we try to artificially restore sea ice. The main point I want to make today is that all technological interventions involve a lot of risk and uncertainty, and the safest and most reliable way to restore Arctic sea ice is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what I had to tell you today. However, I'm happy to talk more about it if you have any questions during the panel discussion at the end. And if you want to learn more about this, here are some references for on this topic. And I'll just leave this here for you for a few seconds while this lovely video from NASA plays so that you have a chance to take a screenshot or a photo of this. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And so we are moving to our last speaker of today, who is Cassandra Brooks. Cassandra, when you're ready, we are.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. And you can see my screen. Fantastic. So it really is such an honor and privilege to be here with this amazing group of scientists and with all of you here today. And as you've already heard this evening, the poles are incredibly important places, and the Antarctic, rightly placed at the center of this map, is absolutely critical to the functioning of Earth systems. It stores the majority of the world's fresh water, drives global ocean circulation, and regulates our climate, storing disproportionate amounts of carbon and heat. But I wanted to share with you too that despite its harsh conditions, as you've already heard about, Antarctic waters teem with life. But actually, the Antarctic contains some of our last healthy marine ecosystems left in the world. And part of the reason we have healthy marine ecosystems, relatively healthy, is that Antarctica has been protected by that amazing shield of ice that forms around it and remoteness. It's really far away. But it's also political will. In the Antarctic, we have this rich history of exploration and science that has created a framework for international collaboration. And I want to highlight in particular the international collaboration of the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, which actually led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. The treaty is amazing. It sets aside the entire continent for the sake of peace and science. It's truly one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Now, under the Antarctic Treaty System is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, which manages the waters around Antarctica. Now, in line with the principles of the treaty, grounded in science and precaution, CAMLR is actually considered a leader in marine resource management. They currently have 27 member states, and all decisions are made by unanimous consensus. And in line with CAMLR's leadership, in 2002, they actually began working towards a network of Southern Ocean Marine Protected Areas, or MPAs, in line with international targets. And indeed, MPAs are an increasingly popular tool for conserving marine biodiversity and also managing fisheries. And as you heard, global targets currently call for 30% of the oceans to be protected by 2030. So we don't have a lot of time to meet that goal. So CAMLR committed to a network of protected areas, but the Ross Sea on the map before you was a priority area. It's the most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean, supporting disproportionate marine life. And actually, in a global assessment of human impacts on the world's ocean, the Ross Sea stood out as being the most intact or least damaged of all marine ecosystems left in the world. I wish I had time to tell you about the flood of media that was created around the Ross Sea, Antarctica, in support of its protection, the efforts to bring the Ross Sea to the policymakers and to the public. The way the Ross Sea was branded as the last ocean through media, including an award-winning documentary and the stunning photography book we delivered into the hands of all CAMLR decision makers, the millions of public citizens that engaged in this campaign. I also wish I had time to share with you the absolute flood of science that was generated in support of protecting the Ross Sea, and how in 2010, the United States and New Zealand began working to develop a proposal for a Ross Sea MPA, and their efforts over many years to develop and modify the proposal, seeking to find trade-offs that would not compromise its conservation value. I wish I could share with you the stories from within the room at CAMLR, who meets every year in Hobart to make policy decisions, and of the diplomatic negotiations over a Ross Sea MPA, which went on until all hours of the night as diplomats worked to find a way forward to reach consensus. And the moment former US Secretary of State John Kerry took on the effort for a Ross Sea MPA and decided he wanted to achieve it during his term. The stories from the White House when President Obama incorporated a Ross Sea MPA into part of climate negotiations with China, or the incredible efforts working within Russia to find the political levers of influence, which finally led to consensus. Now, more than anything, I really wish I could share with all of you that moment in the room on October 28th, 2016, when after more than 10 years of effort, including 5 years of intensive negotiations, CAMLR finally came to consensus. The room exploded in applause, nations were hugging nations, and it became clear that this was not just an incredible environmental win and a gift to future generations. It was both those things, but it was like the signing of the Antarctic Treaty during the Cold War. It was a diplomatic win, and it showed that despite political tensions between some countries, Antarctica continues to be this exceptional space dedicated to peace and science. The picture before you shows New Zealand headed delegation, Gillian Dempster, holding a map of the Ross Sea MPA when the CAMLR Secretariat printed it out after it was adopted and invited all the delegates to come and sign this map. It was clearly a source of pride for CAMLR. And as the world's largest marine protected area, it really should be a source of pride. So thinking back, how did we get consensus? Well, we worked at that intersection of science, policy, and public engagement. And I really can't underestimate that role of public engagement, the huge scientific effort combined with that high-level diplomacy, negotiating trade-offs, building and at times breaking and rebuilding trust, working with opportunities for leadership, which all led to this political window of opportunity. And I think there's a lot of lessons to learn there that we can apply elsewhere, including in the climate space. But I want to come back to this space and how CAMLR committed to a network of marine protected areas that would represent biodiversity in key ecological areas throughout the Southern Ocean. The Ross Sea is just a start. You can see it in gray on the map. There are 4 more critically important MPAs under negotiation, including in the East Antarctic, 2 in the Weddell Sea, and 1 in the Western Antarctic Peninsula. And these proposals alone would contribute roughly 4 million kilometers squared to global protections, moving us closer to meeting those international targets. And I have to highlight that one core objective of most of these MPAs is to provide climate refugia, which are areas that remain relatively buffered from climate change over time, and enable persistence of species. So for Antarctica, this would mean areas more likely to remain cold and icy. For a species like emperor penguins, whose life cycle so intricately depends on robust sea ice and whose populations are predicted to potentially go extinct because of climate change, protecting climate refugia would give them the best chance of potentially adapting and surviving, not to mention all the amazing life that you've heard about throughout these talks today. And to be clear, though, MPAs are one management tool. There are other tools for managing for ecosystem resilience, including implementing more dynamic ecosystem-based fisheries management. Now, in the Antarctic Peninsula, an area rapidly changing where fisheries pressure is increasing, we might need to implement this type of approach. And we need to push for stronger conservation policy now. The threats are only increasing. Beyond climate change, fishing is increasing in the Southern Ocean, and it's increasingly concentrated in coastal areas, potentially competing with foraging penguins and whales, as you can see in this picture in front of you. We have the threat of increasing tourism, with an estimated 117,000 tourists predicted to visit Antarctica in this coming season. We have pollution finding its way south, with the first evidence of microplastics found in Antarctic snow, published just last year. And bird flu, as you might have heard, reached Antarctica just over a month ago, with absolutely dire predictions for the disease spreading throughout the entire region, with devastating consequences for penguins, flying seabirds, and seals. Given all these threats, I would say it might be time to really consider the comprehensive values of the Antarctic, the critical role it plays in all of our lives through its amazing regulating services, not to mention the science, wilderness, heritage, and to consider the full suite of values, not just for this generation, but future ones as well. And I have to share that I used to give talks about Antarctica, calling for protecting this place for the sake of the life that makes its home there. I used to share this story of how I returned to the Antarctic Peninsula region in 2019 after not having been to that area for 8 years. And I had a hard time finding an Adelie penguin, which is my daughter's namesake. She wanted me to send her a picture of one, and yet I had difficulty doing so because they were declining in the region. I used to make a call to protect Antarctica so that my children, including my son, Orion Ross, named for the Ross Sea, could grow up with the Southern Ocean thriving with life. And while protecting Antarctica for the sake of its wildlife is still incredibly important to me, the reasons have become more personal. I'll never forget the day in the middle of 2020 when I took my kids hiking on one of our favorite trails. The late day summer sun and the Rocky Mountains of Colorado were behind me. It was a gorgeous day when suddenly the sky went dark. I turned to see this massive black cloud of smoke expanding out and blotting out the sun, and immediately a cloud of thick ash was raining down on us. The smoke continued for almost 4 months straight that year, with conditions so toxic we pretty much had to stay locked indoors as the expansive forests of Colorado burned. The next year, almost 1,000 homes burned within kilometers of ours. Another record fire, this time in the heart of winter. Now the fires continue with no end in sight, and I'm sure many of you have similar stories, if not of fire, then of other extreme events. And of course, the world is burning. As we've been hearing about, it's warming dramatically. Those early days of June saw us breach that 1.5 degree warming threshold that we already heard about, with predictions that we're likely to exceed that threshold for at least a year within the next 4 years. But it's not hopeless. While IPCC reports call for urgent climate action, they suggest that with immediate reductions in greenhouse gases, we can secure a livable future. And I hope that we've all made clear that Antarctica in the cryosphere is core to that future. What happens in Antarctica has global consequence. And I'm here with you tonight because I wanted to share this story, the story of how the global community came together to create the world's largest MPA in the Ross Sea against many odds. We can do it again in Antarctica and in the Arctic and across the world's oceans. And by doing so, we can help secure a livable future. And I just want to thank you all, both those presenting in this panel and there in the audience, whether you're a scientist, a government official, a conservationist, a climate activist, whatever community you're from, I want to thank you all for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Cassandra. So, do you want to move with me, Sean? So we are moving over here now. Let me see if I have any questions for this. I will also check those. Questions in the room?
So I was wondering, Charlotte, if you could talk about how long the animals that you were talking about in your ecosystem are living, and how susceptible they may be then to 1 year of really low ice cover.
Yeah, thanks for a great question. So the answer to a great question is often it depends, and that is the case here. So there's a huge range of life, as we've all shown, and so it varies from a matter of weeks in the case of the smallest algae and phytoplankton, microscopic plants, up to several decades, up to even 100 years for the larger whales. So a good example, I think, which really gets to the heart of your question, well, I think there are two good examples. One is the Antarctic krill, which lives for about 6 to 7 years, maybe, and has a period at the beginning of its life where it's becoming mature. So if we have 1 year where the sea ice is much weaker than in previous years, then that's probably okay. There will be a smaller recruitment of young krill into big adult krill that can reproduce themselves. But if we get 2 or 3 or 4 years consecutive of low sea ice cover, then the krill population will really struggle to recover from that, and that will take a longer period of time, the longer the low sea ice state has been in place. There is a bit of an effect of different krill populations moving. So, for example, at the Antarctic Peninsula, if we had a year that was very low sea ice towards the northern end, but there was some sea ice in the Bellingshausen Sea at the southern end, we might see that the population along the Antarctic Peninsula was much smaller, but it is then repopulated by the population being transported in the currents from further south. So that recovery might be a bit quicker. The second example is the emperor penguin, which is the only species where there is already published work about the effects of the recent low sea ice conditions in 2022 and 2023. And what Peter Fretwell and colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey found is that the very low sea ice conditions that we saw in summer 2022 caused catastrophic breeding failures for the penguins, because the chicks had to get into the water before they were ready to, before their feathers were suitably developed for the cold conditions of the ocean. So the chicks froze to death in vast numbers. Tens of thousands of chicks just died because they had to go into the water too soon. Now, an emperor penguin lives for about 15 to 20 years, as I said. So it's probably not the case that 1 or 2 bad years will drive them towards extinction. But as the world warms, we are likely to see these low sea ice years occurring more and more often. And therefore, it has been predicted that the emperor penguin could be all but extinct by the end of this century, because those years that really challenge them will become more and more common. So there aren't many species that will be wiped out through 1 low sea ice year, but there are plenty that will become endangered and potentially threatened with extinction as these years become more and more common. Don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that.
I think you really brought it to the point. It's the frequency that makes it happen, and I think everyone sees that in their own lives. If you have like one thing to deal with, you can probably deal with, and but if you have to deal with more and more things or more and more stressors, it'll just become unmanageable. And that's no difference for those species, especially if it is so linked to their actual life cycle.
you. Yes.
I'm quite specific here. I've heard that you get in ice algae that secrete like a goo or something that holds the tubes open. Is that a thing? Because I tried to search for this on the internet, I just couldn't find anything. So I thought someone in this crowd might know.
Do you want to take that one, Delphine?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can try to take that one. Sea ice algae and bacteria as well produce what we call exopolysaccharide or exopolymer, and they're pretty much a gel that they excrete to cope with the large gradients in temperature and salinity, as well as other environmental variables that they experience, and they use that to protect themselves as a cryoprotectant. And there's been some studies that show that the production of that goo, we call it the biofilm as well, is having a big role in the integrity of the sea ice. So there's been some work from Christopher Kramps and others in Canada working on that, and it's quite interesting actually, and it's also a big role in the recycling of nutrients and retention of carbon as well as when the sea ice melts, those exopolysaccharides then create some aggregates that then export that carbon to the seafloor. So yes, the goo does exist in sea ice, and you can actually when you sample the sea ice, you can actually see clumps of ice algae that are adsorbed to that sticky substance within the sea ice.
And I will also add that the process of sea ice actually freezing seems to spur the microorganisms to produce that snot goo, the exopolymeric substances, and it does make very effective aerosols in the atmosphere.
Thank you.
One question.
Thanks. Question. So thank you so much, everyone, for such great talks. This is a little outside of my expertise, so this question may not be like very educated, but I'm curious. It sounds like this is a very complex process or like its own system, and it's really fascinating that all of these things are going on in Antarctica, which is like what I'm looking at just in terms of physical processes like ice sheet and sea level. And I'm curious if these things can be or have been already incorporated in some sort of like modeling framework and been coupled into like physical models, or how is it? It seems like a very complex thing to just describe everything. So like, do you represent this as a parameter, or what sort of, and what kind of the most important mechanism do you think if you have the people and to be incorporated into those physical models?
I can take that, but I want to know, Nadia, would you like to reply?
Yeah, I think just there are a lot of efforts or some efforts to include ice algae into models, but those and they show that there is importance in that they do have impact on the carbon system and on the production, on the emission of DMS, but they are not included yet in Earth system models. That's like, I think that's a step that we're working towards, to recommend that we actually really need to include at least some components of the biogeochemistry in sea ice in those Earth system models. And there are slow efforts starting to have at least tests with those Earth system models. In the US is a model, they have included it, but it's not in the final version that's been submitted to the coupled model in the comparison projects. But yeah, that is like there are efforts. There is lot of, like, there's publications that showcase the importance, but we have not managed to do the step yet to put them into the global Earth system models.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
So I have a question for Lisa Miller. Thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was a really interesting aspect that we don't get to hear about that much. I'm curious about the extent to which these projects are coupled with the scientists that work in these environments. So you mentioned the glass beads, and I was wondering if anyone had thought, you mentioned that the ducks are able to eat the glass beads potentially without any harm, but I was wondering if anyone had experimented with zooplankton, given that they're much, much smaller and their size relative to the glass bead is much more crucial. Has anyone seen if there's been any impact on zooplankton and also the biofilms that are likely to form on top of these silica beads?
Yeah, I haven't heard about that yet, but the glass beads proposal is the one that's actually being most intensively researched. And so, yeah, I haven't heard about any results, any experiments done yet, but there are definitely people thinking about it. And there's a nonprofit company that has actually been, or an organization that has been established to do research on this. And they are, and these kinds of questions are definitely being channeled to them. So not yet, but it's on their radar. Our radar, I should say. We're all responsible for keeping an eye on these people.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Yeah, to what extent do you think the perhaps altruistically thought of projects are actually balanced with the significant harm that they could cause in these environments that are already experiencing a significant amount of stress?
Just make sure I heard that correctly. You're asking about how much thought is going into that balance, or what the chances of these things actually being deployed is?
I guess I would like an answer to both. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. The challenge of evaluating and validating and also monitoring these things is huge. And it's really hard to imagine any of these deployments being able to be done anytime soon because of the level of research, and the governance simply isn't there for to regulate these things. And there's a lot of effort going on to bring the governance up to speed, as well as trying to do the research. My personal feeling is that the uncertainties are just too big for permission to ever be actually achieved. But we've seen that rogue actors can appear. If someone is convinced that they're actually going to be able to make money off of this, they'll go try to do it. And so that's sort of a non-answer. The I guess typical of scientists, it's complicated and it depends.
I really appreciate your answer, actually, and I really appreciate your work in this area and your talk. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Cassandra. So I'm sure that we need more of this marine protected area in the Southern Ocean, and I'm thinking also, especially considering the recent accelerated changes, how can we make sure that we learn something from the Ross Sea example, and how do we get to have the Southern Ocean more protected?
Yeah, thanks so much. And this kind of ties back to the to what Sean was talking about with the loss of sea ice and what it means for ecosystems. And I want to be super clear that marine protected areas won't stop climate change. And so we do need to reduce emissions immediately to do that. But again, they can reduce all those other stressors so that those organisms have the best chance of being resilient. And what we really learned in the example of the Ross Sea is that it does really come down to political will. You've heard so much amazing science today. We have so much great science. There's a lot of uncertainty about what climate change will mean specifically for species and for the system, but we know it's changing the system, and we know we need to do something about that. And so we have enough science to really say we need marine protected areas. For the most part in the Southern Ocean, we know where to put them. I understand there's work going on in the Arctic too, as some of what we heard about today of areas that are important for protection. And so then it really comes down to to political will and to getting governments at the highest level to agree that these places are priorities. And in the context of the Southern Ocean, it's an international space. And so we really do need to get the international agreement in place for that. And what we learned was you got to do all the work ahead of time, have your science in place, have the public engaged. Public engagement is a huge piece of it, have really compelling stories and media. And then when those political windows actually open, you're ready to go through them. And the world is in a crazy time right now, politically, although many people older than me say that it's, we always go through these ebbs and flows of where the world is at. And so I think we just have to be ready that when those political windows open, that we can move through them. And I'm really excited to hear what comes out of this meeting. I'm really excited to hear about new commitments that hopefully come out of it for climate, as well as for the marine space and the cryosphere. Thank you for that question.
Oh, you're welcome. So talking about communication, I have a question actually for all of you, especially because we are here at COP today. How do you think we are doing into communicating the science we are doing to the policy, not only to the policymakers, of course, to the policymakers because we are here, but to the society in general, and also to the communities that are most affected by all of these changes? Anyone that would like to start with?
Yeah, I can probably say something to that. And I'm working mostly in the Arctic, and I work with indigenous communities. And one of my goals really is to better communicate how these climate projections are actually affecting local communities. And I think that's something where we really have not done a good job. Like, we have done a lot of improvement in terms of having better models and higher resolution models, like better protections, both in terms of climate predictions as well as seasonal predictions, which is kind of like an adaptation tool if we know in advance how things look like. People who are actually relying on the ecosystem for subsistence harvesting might be better able to anticipate what is happening in 1 year. But we have done a terrible job in communicating this actually to these communities, like small villages, small Inuit communities, of that these things exist. And it's really only now, when things are getting so bad, that like climate change is so much on their radar, that they're starting to appear like that things get out, that they want to have more information. But there is still also a lot of reluctance internationally, on the international stage, to include these like small groups or indigenous groups adequately into these decision-making processes. So I think really like bringing together these different tools, like linking the models with the impacts and showcasing those impacts, that's still something that we can do a lot better and can do a lot more.
I'm sure you will do, and you are doing, Nadia. Does anyone else want to answer to these questions, where we are with communicating and being effective?
I'll just
do
a quick one. I think as scientists, we do struggle sometimes to communicate our science, especially to stakeholders and governments. We tend to do our research and be very focused on understanding a process and relaying that to our peers, to our other scientists, but we're not doing so well at communicating that to the wider public and policymakers and decision makers. I think we are slowly getting there and understanding that's really important, but we're still lacking some of that engagement with the community outside of the science community. But events like COP, I think, are important for us to engage into, and we at least we're trying, but we can do better.
Sure, too.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that too. I do feel that for so long in my training as a young scientist years ago, I felt like I kept being told not to communicate and not to, don't talk openly, don't advocate your science even, almost. And I do think we're in a time where we're realizing it's really important that even if we're not a space that we feel we should advocate policy, that we have to advocate our science. We have to share our science with the communities that science impacts. And in the context of climate, it does impact everybody. So that means the work like Nadia talked about of actually talking to communities directly impacted by climate change, but us talking to the policymakers as well as the public. And I just want to encourage everybody to do that, to use their voice as much as they can, and to know that at least I think we're in a time where we urgently need to speak up as scientists and to communicate our work.
And I'll just add, I'm looking at this group, I'm realizing I'm actually the oldest here. And and I can say that it has really changed. I mean, yes, we're frustrated. We feel like it's hard, like we're not doing a good enough job, but we have learned so much over the last several decades about how to communicate our science. And part of that has been the need for us to do so, the need for us to make the public and policymakers understand what's happening. But also a big part of it has been the democratization of science, and the fact that we have a much more diverse group of people doing science now. We're doing much more inter and transdisciplinary science, which, even if we're talking to other scientists, they're different enough from us that we have to really think and figure out how to talk to people. And we're getting much better. And fortunately, we're all really smart people. And our life's work is learning new things. And learning how to talk to people differently is part of that. So yeah, fortunately, we all like doing hard things. But I just wanted to add a bit of optimism there that, yeah, we're not doing well enough, but we're doing a lot better and we're on a good trajectory, I think.
I agree. I fully agree, Lisa. Would you like to add something, Sean?
Yeah, I'll answer from a COP-specific point of view, having been here for a week. So for those of you watching this later, this is being filmed on the last day of the first week of COP. So this is a milestone where there should be texts in place done by the negotiators for the ministers who come in next week to agree on, and us all reach consensus and we move forward together with the outcomes of this COP. At the halfway stage, we are, there's still a lot of work to do, I think it's fair to say, across all negotiating streams. Something that we have been working hard at over this week, led by the excellent team of ICCI, is actually engaging directly with negotiators. So I think at a conference like COP, so all of the COPs, whether that be for the United Nations climate change, ARM, the UNFCCC, or the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, whichever part of the United Nations it is, when we as scientists come to these sorts of events, the most important thing we do is speak to the people actually making the decisions. And that has to be done in a very targeted way, and sometimes quite kind of abrupt and possibly intrusive way. If you see a negotiator grabbing a cup of coffee, you go and introduce yourself and you start talking about your science. If you see somebody walking down one of the main avenues at a venue like this, you go over, you start talking to them about your science, or you give them something that tells them something about your science. And that sounds perhaps like it's slightly too much and in people's faces, but these people have a huge amount of work to do, a huge amount of different priorities to balance, and only by making our science very visible do we have any hope of getting it across. So I think we've had some great successes this week. We've met government ministers, we've met lots of negotiators, we've met wider members of delegation teams. But the critical thing is whether the science that we're talking about actually gets into the formal texts that are produced as a result of this conference, that parties agree on that then goes forward to influence policy at the national level and influence behaviour at the individual level. So I think there is huge value in communicating between scientists and working together. Of course there is, but at events where it's a real science policy interface, the most important thing we do is to communicate as clearly and concisely and as and in a way that keeps reinforcing itself and keeps making that message stronger and stronger. That is the way to make real change. So that's what we'll go and do for the couple of hours that are left today, and for those still here next week. I think that's the call to action for scientists attending this COP, so that we can generate a meaningful call to action for the world as a result of this COP.
Well, thank you to Sean and Letizia for being on the ground for us there this week.
I wanted to say that this is really the challenge, because the negotiations are going on, and at the same time there are thousands of side events, and it's just overwhelming to be able to go to the right place in the right. There are so many things, and I think this is really, it's my first COP, so it's learning, and I just arrived, but I think this is really probably the biggest challenge to be here, to be listened while we are here, and not only afterwards, because maybe afterwards then it's too late. So, all right. Anyone else want to add something? I didn't see any questions online. Emmy? Yeah. If not, I would like to thank all our speakers today, and I would like to thank once more ICCI for hosting us, and we will follow up. Thank you.
Thank you all